even more books. This is the biggest haul from our Vermont road trip. These are from Monroe Street Books in Middlebury, Vermont. It's a store with thousands of used and antique books. It's awesome, and I told the guy so. So first up, I got a couple of big, thick books by Jack London. These are collections of short stories, and he was an outdoorsy kind of writer. He wrote a lot of, I guess you'd call adventure fiction, or like survival stuff, people in the wilderness doing crazy stuff, you know, a little bit of supernatural and sci-fi here and there, but mostly he wrote about, well, his most famous books were Call of the Wild and White Fang, which are both about dogs, and feature the Klondike heavily. And you can tell he was just inspired by that region. He lived a really short, really adventurous life that's really interesting all in itself. And it's kind of a sad story, but anyways, it's still worth hearing. Next up in short story collections, I got Robert E. Howard. He was like the big pulp writer in the early, mid 20th century. Him, H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, they were like the big three. And he most famously wrote Conan, in a ton of short stories about Conan. And he had a few other characters that weren't quite as big. One of them is Solomon Kane, who is a sort of Puritan, like, guy who goes around and just fights evil. He finds demons, fights them, and kills them. And, it's all in a day's work. And then the other one is Cull, Exile of Atlantis. And this is kind of a proto-Conan, it seems like. He's a warrior. He lives in Atlantis. And from what I remember, he fights a conspiracy of lizard men. So that's him. Speaking of Clark Ashton Smith, this is the first time I ever found one of his books in print form. I'm not sure why. He's just not that well known nowadays, I guess. But anyways, this is Out of Space and Time, and it was printed apparently first in the 70s, but its stories are all from the 30s. And he wrote a mix of science fiction, fantasy, horror. It's such a menagerie of different elements going on in his stories that it's hard to even explain. Some of his stories were set in Atlantis, and some were set in this medieval dark version of France, and there were some that were set on other planets, and there's wizards, there's monsters, there's all kinds of stuff. And H.P. Lovecraft says about Clark Ashton Smith, in sheer demonic strangeness and fertility of conception, Smith is perhaps unexcelled by any other writer. So there you go. I got The Summer Tree by Guy Gavriel Key, and he's a writer mostly of fantasy, and it's set in settings that strongly resemble actual historical settings, like Renaissance Italy or medieval China. This one seems to be Arthurian, and it's fairly short, so I figure it's a good one to start with. And I'm really excited because he's very highly thought of, especially for his prose, like his actual sentence-to-sentence writing, and that's something that I really value in an author. So I'm going to check this out soon. And then we got Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson. This dude writes labyrinthine, intricate plots that involve science and philosophy and all kinds of ideas. And apparently this one's cyberpunk. It was written in the early 90s. And the main character is called Hero Protagonist, if that tells you anything. I don't know what it tells me. But this is supposed to be a good one. And then finally, I got an oddball pick. Tobacco Road by Erskine Caldwell. This guy writes really dark stories, mostly set in the American South. And like a lot of these authors, he's deceased. But anyways, this one's set in kind of the worst of the Great Depression in, I believe, Georgia. And his stories, we read one of them in college. And from what I remember, it was so dark that it was almost like Southern Gothic. And it deals with a lot of social issues with racism and poverty and all sorts of, whatnot. So, it's a little bit of a different pick for me, but I've been thinking about his other book that we read ever since we read it. So, the other book was God's Little Acre, and I'm not sure I ever finished it because I was a bad student, but I'll finally make it up to Erskine Caldwell by reading this. That's it for my massive 3 video long book haul. Thank you for watching. I'm gonna try not to buy any books for a little while at least, which I don't know, we'll see if I stick to that. But appreciate you watching again. Yeah, take care.